Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you're getting sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask is that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. As a Christmas bonus to you this year, I am going to give away another Real Vision TV subscription, a 1-year subscription. So if you want that or interested in that, comment below. Give me a good reason why I should pick you. Again, for those who maybe aren't familiar with the Real Vision, I highly encourage you to check them out. Some of the best long-form video content covering the entire financial space, interviewing basically the legends of finance. So I find it highly not only entertaining but educational, which I think is extremely important in today's environment. Speaking of which, they actually just did a segment on housing. They did a full week of interviews just strictly on housing, so I think that's really no better time than to give away a 1-year subscription. So again, comment below if you're interested in that. But also adding on that housing, I'm going to encourage you to check one more thing out. There was a podcast recently coming out called the Jolly Swagman podcast. They interviewed my favorite economist, or one of them, Amir Sufi, who wrote the book House of Debt. This basically covers the premise around household indebtedness and how it typically leads to financial crises, and obviously the interconnectedness of household debt and rising home prices, and all the sort of interconnectedness of those two mechanisms. So highly encourage you to check that out. I'll put a link below to that podcast, the Jolly Swagman podcast with Amir Sufi. But if we bring it all back, talking about Real Vision, podcasts, etc., a lot of that sort of topic and focus has been on the Australian housing market. But I think that we're all aware is there's a lot of similarities between the Canadian real estate market and the Aussie housing market. Obviously, we know that both sort of escaped the financial crisis, both have some of the most leveraged household balance sheets in the modern economy, and both have extremely high home prices that have also benefited off of foreign inflows. So, I found it interesting is in one of those Real Vision interviews. If you look at the Australian housing market right now, they're actually, and I still think that they're actually ahead of the Canadian housing market. They're actually going through, after a substantial drop in home prices and some concerns of credit deterioration, the central bank has been slashing interest rates, and you're actually seeing a recovery right now in the Aussie housing market. But if you kind of unpack what's happening in the Aussie housing market, what the interviewer says is, we're seeing this recovery in the Aussie housing market, but the environment is not conducive to a recovery, i.e., there's a lot of uncertainty around, is this recovery going to be sustainable? So what he's saying is, right now in Australia, is you have a contracting labor market, you have rising delinquencies and insolvencies, and really weak wage growth, and an increase in foreclosures. So he's like, well, how are we going to see a substantial rise and recovery in home prices if those conditions in the background continue to deteriorate? Obviously, the strength of households and the strength of the labor market play such a key component in housing. And it kind of allowed me to frame the Canadian version, so to speak, of what we're seeing. So I think there are a lot of the same dynamics we can see in the Canadian housing market. So if you look at the November 2019 figures for the Canadian real estate market, so sales from a national perspective, and again, all real estate markets are local and regional, but at the end of the day, if you look at the national real estate market as a whole, it will provide you with sort of a larger macro overview, which ultimately is used to create policies around the overall economy. So if you look at the Canadian real estate market, you had home sales in November, and this has been a trend, are actually above the long-term 10-year average. So home sales activity is actually quite strong, has rebounded significantly in Canada, and the home price index, after turning negative in 2018, after contracting for 5 consecutive months, national home prices are actually rising again. I believe they're up 2.4% on a year-over-year basis in November, and there's certainly more indications pointing towards higher home prices. And so that's left no shortage of forecasts and commentary in the media suggesting that the home price recovery is on. We're going to see higher prices in 2020, 5 or 6%, et cetera, et cetera. But again, if we strip that all back, and I'm not ruling that out, I think it's certainly a likely scenario. It's certainly a possibility that home prices will rise in 2020, but certainly the macro conditions behind it are not, again, conducive to that growth. So let's look at that. So you had rising home prices, and we've recently just had a string of data which showed the Canadian labor market, albeit volatile statistics. The labor market contracted 71,000 in November. It was the single largest annual decline, I believe, since 2009. So you have the labor market is showing some signs of potential contraction. We'll have to wait and see how that progresses over the next couple months. So you have that contraction in the labor force. You have retail sales earlier this week also printed a contraction of 1.4% sales, retail sales volumes contracting. And if you look at retail sales from a 2-year window, they've basically been flat for the last 2 years. So there's basically been zero growth in retail sales. And you have consumer insolvencies, i.e. households, consumer insolvencies growing at the fastest pace since 2009. So consumer insolvencies, i.e. the amount of people going bankrupt, or not bankrupt, but filing for proposals, which is basically another softer version of a bankruptcy, is year to date, so January through, I believe the latest statistic are as of September, that 9-month period is the second highest number of consumer insolvencies since the 1970s. So you have, again, you have flat to declining retail sales over the past couple of years. You have a labor force that is now just starting to show signs of potentially contracting. And you have consumer insolvencies that are rising at a pace that is a little bit concerning, given the fact that there hasn't been any sort of shock to the system. There hasn't been, there hasn't really been any rising interest rates. There hasn't been, a significant drop off in employment where, these are recessionary employment conditions. So there's nothing that's really sparked any sort of reason for consumer insolvencies to suddenly be surging, other than households are simply over leveraged, and there's basically the debt is essentially just mounting and becoming insurmountable. So you have this environment that is kind of playing in the background. So you'd say, well, like how do home prices rise in a scenario with all these things in play? I think that's where you might question the supposed recovery that is supposed to take place into 2020. Again, I'm not saying that isn't going to happen, but I find that interesting that it's going to play out in that environment. So I think you would have to see those conditions flip. We had certainly been wrong before, but I guess you could argue that one of the potential causations for home prices, the argument for higher home prices, obviously Canada's population growth, which continues to spit out growing at the fastest pace as well since the 1970s. So the Canadian population growth continues. Basically the supposed human stimulus is continuing here in Canada. So, but again, I look at that and say, okay, well, if you have this rising massive population growth, and yet retail sales are still in the dumps, and you're adding all these people, you would think sales volumes would be much higher. So I think if you even were to adjust retail sales volumes for the population growth, it's arguably even makes the situation even worse. And of course, we know that real GDP on a per capita basis is actually contracting into negative territory. So basically, the population growth, all it does is essentially masks over a lot of the issues. It tries to essentially paper over them. So you'll see, GDP growth growing at, whatever percentage it is, but a lot of that is just because you're adding more and more people into the population. So I always find it interesting that this doesn't really get brought up by policymakers, or nobody really questions the population growth that's coming in. I mean, again, you're in a scenario where, everybody's talking about supply shortage, housing shortage, not enough housing, and yet, you're continuing to pump in more and more people, more and more immigration, but you haven't actually solved or created an ability to actually house your own existing people today. And I just find that fascinating from a federal, say, election. We just went through that whole federal election, that nobody really brought any of that up. Nobody brought up that, the economy on a per capita basis is actually contracting. Nobody brought up that, there's still a housing shortage, and that, all these sort of factors that have been in place. So, that's kind of my thoughts on the whole housing week moving into 2020. I think next week we'll do a sort of forecast, end of the year, moving into 2020, sort of what, maybe what do I expect, or what am I keeping an eye on. But yeah, I'm still in the camp that the current conditions are showing rising home prices. The current conditions are showing a recovery, which I think is certainly plausible heading into 2020. But I think that the conditions behind it certainly raise the debate that how sustainable and how long will that recovery persist. That's what I'm watching, and I'm obviously watching with a keen eye what is prevailing in Australia. And I think the recent interviews by Real Vision TV have helped enhance some of those insights. So hope that helped. Otherwise, see you next week.